Welcome to ClubCast, the Clubland podcast. I'm Dr. Seth Tiffel. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by the publishing phenomenon Ben Schott. Ben wrote an instant bestseller in 2002 in Schott's original Miscellany, still the definitive book of trivia for every home. And along with its sequels, it sold 2.5 million copies worldwide. Ben has also penned 2 novels, licensed by the P.G. Wodehouse estate, to continue the adventures of Bertie Wooster, Jeeves and the King of Clubs in 2018, and Jeeves and the Leap of Faith in 2020. And we may come on to those later. But he's now returned to the world of quirky, niche and addictive reference works, with his first one in over a decade, Schott's Significa, which looks at the argot, slang, idiom, dialect, patois, and colloquialisms of any number of subcultures. And there is, of course, a whole section on language in London's Clubland. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Ben Schott. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thank you for having me, Seth.
Can I ask what prompted you to write this new book on language?
So it all started when my wife came back from a party and she was wearing a badge that said FOJB on it. And I was like, well, what does that mean? And it turns out it means Friends of Jimmy Bradley, who was a New York restaurateur behind a restaurant called the Red Cat. And he used this code in his reservation system as a way to indicate which diners required some extra love, a better table, a glass of, champagne, a free dessert, because it was a way of sort of, being nice to his friends. And I saw this and I thought, I wonder if other restaurants use similar codes in their systems. And if they do, whether there would be an article in it. They did, and there was. So I wrote a piece for the New York Times on the sort of secret language of restaurants. And from that, this kind of fascination with secret languages, secret codes, secret systems of knowledge evolved and became the book Schott's Significa many years later.
Language has come up quite a lot in your books. I mean, we were saying just before the show that it's a big part of your Jeeves novels, for instance.
So I've written lots of books on language and language. I mean, Schott was a book about the German language and about how you can create new words using German's kind of jigsaw linguistic process to create words where English didn't have a word for the human condition. Mm-hmm. So one example is Herbstlaub-Trittvergnügen. I apologize for my German listeners for my pronunciation, which means the joy of kicking through piles of autumn leaves, for which there should be a word, and we created one in German. So that was a book very much about language. The last 2 books I wrote before Schott Significa were these Jeeves novels. I got permission from the Wodehouse estate to write 2 new Jeeves and Wooster novels. And in some ways, they were as much about language as about novelizing. I really try to get into the language that Wodehouse used because that's the only way to write kind of in parallel with him. And for example, he has about 1,600, maybe more, quotes in the Oxford English Dictionary, but he has 26 first cited usages. So 26 words where he is the first author to have used that in this context. For example, cuppa, as in cup of tea, gloriously. So I got all of those 26 words into the first Jeeves book as the kind of nod to the man's linguistic mastery.
And he has a very distinctive style. I mean, it's this extraordinary combination of formal, classical, almost Shakespearean English with informal slang from lots of different styles and influences.
I have had the honor of holding his Bible, the Bible that he had. And he knew his Bible, he knew his Shakespeare. He absolutely was steeped in the literature of the English language. And that's what allowed him to be so ludic and playful. And there's this term in psychiatry called night's move thinking. And it often presents people with some kind of dementia or this kind of thing, where they go from subject A to subject C. And to the listener, it seems like it's just irrational. But what they do is they miss out the B. Like a knight moves in chess, it jumps vertically and then jumps horizontally, but they miss out the vertical jump. And he had a similar linguistic kind of trick where he would take you down a path of a simile and then suddenly spring a linguistic trap. And if you find yourself laughing because it's such an bizarre and curious use of language. He was so wet you could shoot snipe off him. I mean, it's just like, wait, what? And so his mastery of language and his lightness came from a deep, deep understanding of the structure and the bones of it.
And you in presenting language in this book, I mean, there are some really interesting things like there's a section that compares fox hunting terms side by side with the slang of hunt saboteurs. That seems quite in keeping with a lot of the earlier things you've done, where there's a lot of presentation of information in quite unusual, quirky ways.
So I perhaps unusually typeset my books. So I literally present my publishers with a PDF. So the typeset, the layout, the graphics, everything is done by me. And that's partly because I'm a control freak, and partly because as you're writing into the design, you get a sense of rhythm and flow. Too much, too little. Have we got a critical mass? So one of the 53 languages sort of explored in the book, as you say, is the language of fox hunting, which has always interested me. And it's quite ancient. I mean, it's, centuries old, some of these terms, and whippers in and view-halloo and all of these, things that you have sort of seen. But it's incredibly detailed, and there's a huge amount of tradition. And in researching this, I thought, well, this is interesting, but it's quite historical. And I was keen not to make things overly historical. But one of the things that isn't historical is hunt saboteurs. And hunt saboteurs are, as I'm sure your listeners know, people who turn up to the hunts to literally sabotage them, to try and protect the fox by drawing off the hounds and just causing, mayhem and disorder. Sometimes peaceful, sometimes less peaceful. And so I managed to find some hunt saboteurs who would talk to me, which in itself was quite complicated, and got their language and their terminology, some of which they share with the hunt, obviously, and some of which are new. So, for example, there's something called the gizmo. And the gizmo used to be this big sort of blocky amplifier system. And the gizmo would play the sound of the hounds baying in order to confuse the hounds and draw them off from the fox. So they would essentially play, the hounds would hear themselves, and they would actually record each individual pack. So the hounds heard themselves, but they didn't know it was themselves. And so the gizmo, which was this big bulky thing, and now you can play it on your iPhone, is a way of an auditory sabotage to confuse the hounds in the heat of the moment. And so when I was designing the book, the language of the hunt is all in black, and it's sort of black text, and the language of the hunt saboteurs pops up in red to sort of disrupt the flow of the language of the fox hunt.
Now, you're quite a club aficionado, if you don't mind my saying, and there's obviously a section of the book just about language in clubs where you refer to them as being timelessly idiosyncratic. I was going to ask, for you, what is the appeal of a club?
So one of the reasons I chose to put the language of clubs into the book is that it is a private language. And like the other languages, like sommeliers and bartenders and auctioneers and graffiti writers, I'm interested is when civilians enter expert systems, and we're all civilians for the vast majority of our lives. When you go and buy a diamond ring for your partner, you're entering into the diamond district, and that's a whole world where they are experts and you're a civilian. And clubs are just one such world. And given one who loves clubs, it occurred to me this is a language and a culture that I find very familiar, having been a member of many clubs over the last 20 years. But a lot of the world, when I bring guests, they're like, well, this is just bizarre and strange. It's like, this is odd. Like, how come the guest menus have no prices? These small little sort of traditions of clubs are the things that sort of define them and I think make them charming and make them, I hope, interesting as part of the book.
And casting your mind back a bit, how have you sort of adjusted over these last 20 years from being a relative newcomer to clubs to one who's steeped in them?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, listen, I'm talking to Seth, the man who is more steeped in more clubs than anyone I ever know, as your new book absolutely defines. A lot of these things you just pick up, you observe, and it's not so much a secret language. Some of the languages in the books are pretty secret. The language of the Diamond District, Venetian gondoliers, they want to keep this close because it's a way of keeping out civilians and punters. Clubs, I just think it's something that you get used to. And over time, most people get introduced by a club by an uncle or a father or a friend, and they go and they're feeling like a fish out of water. And then the more you go, the more you go. And it's about belonging. And I think that's one of the things that makes them timeless is that it's like the TV show Cheers. Norm walks into the pub and everyone just goes Norm, and of course that doesn't often happen at the Reform Club. But that notion of belonging that's part of like private clubs in London, but also working men's clubs and on the terraces and at Lord's and even at your local village pub, the sense of belonging and camaraderie, the sense that you will see people who share, not necessarily every opinion, but share a kind of a common cause of a way to spend time. Sociologists have called it the third place, but it's much more ancient than that. I think it's about belonging and camaraderie and a kind of effortless ease and friendship. Comfortable slippers might be the best way to, visually describe it.
I like that. And clubs very much have their own unique culinary culture. I wouldn't say that they are the best dishes by any means. Sometimes can be quite the reverse, but it's quite a personal thing. And I was going to ask you what your favorite sort of dishes would be when you were in a club.
So I tend to err on the side of club caution. There's always a moment where the new chef decides to do the squid ink risotto. And on the whole, the more English and traditional and ancient dish, like sort of lamb chops or smoked salmon or, club pie is probably much safer than something very imaginative. There was a tradition that clubs were essentially nursery food. And I think they were for many years. There was almost a pride, the English for years took pride in being, innumerate. Oh, I can't do maths. And also a certain pride in being sort of terrible in the kitchen. And that's absolutely changed now. Yep. And, really you can get some absolutely astonishingly good meals at remarkably reasonable prices compared to the Mayfair St. James's restaurants that surround clubs. So if in doubt, I always advise my guests, be cautious, be traditional.
Yes, and you talk on pricing in the book about clubs being expensive to join but cheap to use as very much being the idea around that.
Yes, and actually, clubs are. I think you told me this. This is fascinating. I didn't realize this, but clubs are sort of counter-cyclical. So they often do well in recessions because they are actually relatively cheap, and the wine is chosen years earlier and laid down, and it's not necessarily created to make a profit. But just to kind of tick along and make sure the club survives. And it's a very different mindset from a restaurant, which is, hugely battling for survival and, incredibly choppy, economic headwinds.
Well, indeed. And they're not in the game of huge margins at a restaurant needs just to survive and these sorts of things.
Exactly.
We've already sort of touched on your view of the sociability of one club, at least. I was thinking of another club that might have been less than pleased at some things you've written about them in the past.
So in the first Jeeves book, Jeeves and the King of Clubs, Bertie, obviously, as we know, is a member of the Drones, and Jeeves is a member of the Junior Ganymede Club. So clubs obviously are a central part of the Woodhouse oeuvre, so especially the Jeeves and Wooster element of it. And so the King of Clubs is set in Clubland. And there's a moment where Bertie zips down to, have a quick snifter at the Drones, only to discover that it's closed for the summer vac. And he pockets his Drones Club diary to find that reciprocal rights are being offered at the Athenaeum, and his heart sinks, and he describes it as the club of last resort. And about a year after the publication, I got a letter from the librarian at the Athenaeum saying, "Dear Mr. Schott, we, as a rule, the library does not take novels unless by members because it's not really that kind of library. However, you were so rude about the Athenaeum, we thought it was only right that we buy a copy for our members to peruse." So I was a little mean about the Athenaeum, although it did have a reputation for being full of incredibly dull, sort of monotone bishops. And there was even an area known as Temperance Corner, where sort of, people just drank, weak squash and, ate their fatty cutlet. I haven't been for a bit. People say it's slightly more lively, but it's not necessarily my favorite club. I mean, I can never forgive them for making Jimmy Savile a member. So.
Well, indeed. No, I think that we'll find that, as I said in my last book, there are fewer bishops than the reputation would suggest.
Well, this is true. But can you have too many bishops? I don't know.
Oh, it's all relative. Two of the more dramatic events in the life of somebody joining a club are first joining and then actually leaving. And you have quite a bit to say on both of those in the book.
Well, I mean, joining is essentially it's childbirth, as it were. I mean, it's the beginning of everything. So, on the whole, people go to clubs and then they decide to join. And why would you join a club? On the whole, clubs are expensive and difficult to join. So there's quite a hurdle for most proper clubs as I view them. And it's a non-trivial task. So most of your listeners, I assume, know the process. So, you have to be proposed and seconded, and then there's letters, or there's a book that has to be signed, and then sometimes there are interviews, and it can take, many, many years, and people don't get in. And there was a tradition back in the day that if your candidate that you nominated was rejected or blackballed, you would resign, because it was a sort of transferative shame. And so to have a candidate who didn't get in was just, humiliation too great to bear. Now it's just like, well, it's a numbers game, and you shake it off at the bar. And then leaving. I mean, leaving is also interesting. I mean, obviously I can't discuss the details of clubs I'm a member of, but I have actually sort of been witness to certainly one expulsion, and it's actually two expulsions now I think about it. It's incredibly traumatic. It's traumatic, obviously, for the member, and it's traumatic for the club. And the processes are quite rococo, and there are extraordinary meetings, and there are votes. It's not something to be done lightly, and it often creates tremendous ill will, which essentially is a very good reason to pick your members carefully, because getting rid of them is not easy.
No, the whole process of expulsion is not only very much a last resort, but I often say that in this age of litigation, it's one fraught with peril, which is why clubs are very, very reluctant to go down that path at all. And when they do,
so I have a friend, maybe a mutual friend, no names, no pat drill, who is in a club of which I'm not a member, and members of the committee, or I think, are threatening to sue each other. And it's just, it's just
probably
insane.
Not going to talk about any live cases, but I was going to suggest that it's a very simple matter of public record to look up court judgments relating to previous lawsuits, some of which are not that old cases, actually. And yes,
and if anyone's going to do that, Seth, it's going to be you.
Naturally, how do you think I spend my Sundays? Your book also describes several of the more secretive things in clubs, like the candidates book and the ballot box. I mean, these both obviously relate to joining, but why are these things clothed in such mystery?
That's a really good question. I think there's probably slightly less mystery than people think. The whole notion of the black ball and, the black pill, and, you put your hand into the voting machine and this kind of thing. And there's all sorts of great stories, sort of 19th century stories about, someone that they open up the voting box and there's like 11 black balls, but only 8 voting members. And you think, well, something very odd is going on here. I think nowadays there's probably much more openness, and it's much more of a sort of a committee sense, partly because I think it needs to be fair, and I think partly people sort of want to make sure that their candidates are being given a fair shake. So I think it's probably less I think it's still time consuming, but I think it's probably less cloak and dagger than it used to be.
Yeah, and it varies considerably from club to club. I mean, on the one hand, you have things where you only need one proposer, and on the other hand, in addition to a proposer and a seconder and letters of reference, you end up needing, I think, 35 signatures officially in one club, 55 unofficially in one club. So
it depends on the size of the club, and then obviously their need for new blood. But it is the Garrick has a line which is a public line. So it would be better that 10 unobjectionable men should be excluded than one terrible bore should be admitted. And I think there is some logic to that, although I don't think it always works.
Yes, no, it's a much quoted line and the ethos of quite a few clubs.
Yes.
On a more sort of general point, as a prosaic thing, I'm weirdly obsessed with the idea of the club bore. And I see that he or she gets a mention in your book.
Well, the club bore is it's a thing of legend up until you meet them, and then you realize it's a thing of very much reality.
Bitter experience.
And there's something about a club ball that you just, as they kind of loom down on you at the club table, you just think, oh. And there have been times where I pop my head in and realize the only seat is next to, this certain individual. I'm just like, you know what, I'd rather just go, Pizza Express is looking incredibly appealing right now. I think, any group has, one or two dull apples. There is always that sense, though, the kind of Widmer pool of the group, which is if you look around the table and you can't spot the Widmer pool, it might be you. So sometimes you do have to, just check yourself. Have I told this anecdote before? I don't know. Maybe I should err on the side of, asking questions rather than blurting halitotically like some men do.
But I always think there's something about the logistics of a club table that if by definition you have five people around you, one on either side and three in front of you, there may well be one or two quite dull people there, but actually there is a decent chance that three or four of the people around you will be quite interesting. So those are pretty good odds in any gathering.
Absolutely. And I mean, you talk about the club table, and in a sense, I think the club table is the essence of a club. And again, I imagine many of your listeners, but anyone who doesn't, the club table is, normally a central table or a peripheral table where you sit in the order of your arrival. You can't book, you just turn up. And sometimes it's just for club members, and sometimes you can bring a guest, but it's essentially a kind of random happenstance of dining. And it's staggered, so you can turn up at 1 o'clock and turn up at 1:30, and it's there's no formality, and you're expected to sit and talk with your neighbors. And it's something not everyone enjoys, but I do think it's the essence of a club. And I sort of think if you wouldn't want to sit at the club table of a club, you shouldn't join it. Clubs aren't just sort of private restaurants, or rather, in my opinion, they aren't just that. There also should be a sense of meeting fellow members. And there was an old Victorian line, which is you are guests under a roof, which meant that if you were at a house party, you didn't wait to be introduced because the host was the roof. And therefore, you could go up to people and say, hello, I'm Ben, rather than waiting for a formal introduction. And I think a club does that. And a club table is, I think it's the beating heart of many clubs. And, that's sort of for me, and of course, there are some clubs where there is only a club table. And I think that's almost like the purest essence of what it is to be in a proper club.
And your book quite rightly pays tribute to club staff, particularly the degree of certainty there. You don't know whether you'll meet a member on any given day, but you know that the staff will be there day in, day out, or somebody will be there.
Absolutely.
The other end of that, though,
sorry,
is just that the club table is really the sort of personification of the member side, that there's no control the club has over who will turn up to the club table. It might be the most dreadful people imaginable, it might be the very best. But there's an element of chance and of luck. And there's something of that about the club as well, the uncertainty.
Well, I mean, I talked earlier about norm, and I think a lot of people who don't sort of go to clubs regularly assume that you go and you always meet your friends. And often, I mean, maybe I don't have many friends, but often you don't. But the staff are always there. And actually having a warm welcome from the staff, or, the bartender who knows your drink, or, the maitre d' who will always find you a table if they can. I mean, that's actually the joy. And, you develop long friendships with staff. And when staff leave, often members are very generous. There's often some kind of collection. And I actually think it's not just, they are sort of nice to have. It is actually oddly such a central part of the club that people don't necessarily think about and they sort of take for granted. So yeah, no, I think the staff really are central and can absolutely make or break a club.
And my latest book quotes you on the subject of what you call ersatz clubs, things that are meant to look and feel like traditional clubs, but that are really profit-making enterprises. And you write a little bit about them in this book as well. Do you want to maybe elaborate on that?
So you and I have a slight disagreement, which I like about this. So I make a distinction between clubs that are owned by their members and clubs that are private enterprises. And what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, oddly sort of post-COVID, I mean, it began before, is this explosion of what I call ersatz clubs that are essentially fake clubs in the sense that they're not owned and run by their members for their members. So it's the difference between renting and owning. And there are dozens of them: Maison Estelle, the Fitzdares Club, Apollo's Muse, Oswald's, Mark's Clubs, 5 Hertford Street, the 22, Homeground. I mean, the list is huge, and there are more and more of them are growing. But you're not really joining a club. You are essentially paying dues to be a member of a private restaurant. And, any serious club or proper club, maybe I should say, the members could vote that we only serve red wine on Tuesdays, or you have to wear top hats, or women are not allowed, or women are allowed. I mean, these things can be voted on and changed. Whereas if you join one of these private groups, you're essentially just a peon. And so I think Soho House is the most astonishing example. Soho House, people think of it as a club, but it really isn't. I mean, there are 250,000 members and 100,000 on the waiting list. And it's a remarkable business, don't get me wrong. And some of the properties are absolutely exquisite. But then, it was floated on the stock exchange. So the real members of Soho House are the shareholders. And the members who go in and buy, their £22 glass of champagne, they're the idiots, in a sense, who are paying for the real members who are the shareholders. So it's a real question about ownership and belonging. But I know you feel differently on this.
Well, not that differently. As I think it's a difference in nuance between us. The main difference I would strike is the historian in me looks at these and sees an obvious and immediate parallel with the very earliest clubs from the 18th century, all of which were operated for profit by private landlords in exactly the same way. And if you look at these places like White's, Boodle's, Brooks's, named after either the manager or the owner, they started out as proprietary clubs. They later became member-owned clubs. Now, the member-owned club is, of course, a 19th century construct and became the predominant model. And by and large, I think actually there's a lot more in it for the members in a member-owned club, and I say that as somebody who belongs primarily to member-owned clubs. That said, there's obviously an appeal, and I think that part of that rests in the fact that people are willing to suspend their complete lack of co-ownership of the club, their lack of say over the club, if they have complete faith in the management and in its masterful ability to do things well. And if you want an example of that, I'd have thought someone like Robin Burley, and before that his father Mark Burley, are very good examples of people who, they may not be my personal choice of clubs, but they're very much something that's extremely well run, and people can agree on that. I think part of the problem is that there are a lot of people out there who fancy themselves as Robin Burley, and then there are a lot of rather bland corporations that fancy themselves as Robin Burley that don't have quite that level of attention to detail and don't have that sort of scalable interest. So, we're not a million miles apart on this. It's a difference, I think, more of emphasis.
Listen, you make an excellent point, and the history is interesting, and I do think Burley is absolutely an exception and sets an incredibly high bar. There's also a question of longevity. I mean, you have to wonder, the Arding Rooms or the Dally or, Homegrown or One Warwick, are they going to be there in 10 years, 20 years, 100 years?
You make a very good point, because the Dally actually closed down after only about...
I didn't even notice. There you go.
It closed down, I think it was about 8 months of trading that they had. And you mentioned the Fitzdares Club earlier. That's closed down as well, because, yes, the turnover of a lot of these new clubs is very, very high.
And so... it'll be interesting to see whether 5 Hertford Street, ends up being owned by its members in 75 years. I would be very surprised. And again, I haven't got a problem at all with people joining these clubs, and some of them are remarkable. Oswald's is very nice. The 5 Hertford Street is charming. Home House is, a stunning building, remarkable. I do think there is a difference, and there should almost be another word, because I do think this notion of joining a club, there is a distinction between a club that's owned and run by and for its members has a very different mindset than one that is essentially purely out for shareholder value.
No, I think that's very fair.
And I mean, it's as I say, it's the difference between sort of, between renting and buying. It's like, you're basically paying for someone else's mortgage rather than creating something that, you as a member can control and change, join a committee, join the library committee, join the wine committee, join the membership committee, and absolutely change what the club is and evolve over time. And, for example, allow women in, after hundreds of years of not, and say this is a new dawn.
I completely agree with you on the need for greater transparency, actually, to their own members or potential members on that. In that, one of the things I put into my last book, which didn't necessarily get any universal facts from every club, was just simply who owns each club, which I think people have a right to know. And actually, when you have that sort of level of transparency, it becomes much clearer. That's not to say that there's necessarily something wrong with a club being a proprietary club. I mean, if you look at something like Pratt's as a quintessential London club, about as traditional as it gets. That's entirely owned by the family of the Duke of Devonshire and has been for decades.
Indeed, no, and it's not necessarily saying. Well, I suppose it is. I think I suppose there should be a sort of a capital C club, or maybe club with a K or something. I just think there is a difference, and I see this in New York where there's an explosion of clubs, and people sort of say they're joining a club, and they feel that it's sold to them in some ways as joining this kind of social organization, and it really isn't, and the experience is not that. And that may be why there's so much turnover, is that people go and they just realize, well, actually, why is this restaurant that I'm paying $2,000 a year to be a member of any different from one of the 500 restaurants in a 2-mile radius? Why am I paying to be a member of a restaurant?
You've talked about clubs in New York. How do you find that clubs around the world really compare to their London counterparts?
Well, I mean, I'm going to defer to you, who probably knows more about this than most people alive. One of the joys of proper clubs, shall we say, is reciprocity, and this notion that you have reciprocal clubs around the world. And I have to say, you do have to slightly sort of be slightly bold, and I'm not necessarily the most confident person walking up the stairs of the Travelers Club on the Champs-Elysees, because it's quite intimidating going to another private club in another country in another language. I think it's tremendous fun when you do. I spent a lot of time trying to find the reciprocal club in Venice. I cannot tell you how this is down off a Calais, down a thing. There's a man, there's a gate, there's a porter who takes you across the thing. There's another gate. You go through this thing. There's a tiny elevator. You go up. There's a little walkway. You knock on a door, and then you enter this bizarre chintzy room that overlooks the Grand Canal. I mean, it's insane. And the very nice secretary said, well, if you are coming for supper, perhaps let us know before 5 o'clock or the chef goes home. So one of the joys is, these options to open reciprocal clubs, which, by the way, just to give some credit to Soho House, they have done astonishingly. I mean, Soho House, I always think, is a bit like Margaret Thatcher, more popular the further you get from Britain. So, some of the Soho House properties are absolutely remarkable around the world. And I can completely see why you might want to join for that reason. So, yeah, reciprocity and a certain amount of courage, at least on my part, to enter into terra sort of incognita in a completely foreign language in a different club, making sure you're wearing the right kind of footwear.
Well, Ben Schott, thank you very much.
Seth, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise.
And that's it for this week's Clubcast. Thanks for joining us, and do tune in next time. And if you have any questions or requests for topics for future editions, please do feel free to get in touch. For more updates on the world of private members' clubs, ranging from pages from history to the very latest news, don't forget to subscribe at clubland.substack.com. That was Clubland. You've been listening to HMS Pinafore by the Doyley Cart Company, conducted by Malcolm Sargent.